A man is trapped in orbit, helplessly watching as his wife and children are slaughtered on Earth. A surrogate body, identical in every way, kisses a woman he was never meant to touch. Two astronauts sit in silence, adrift in deep space, the warmth of home now reduced to memory and ash. Beyond the Sea, Episode 3 of Black Mirror's 6th season, doesn't play like conventional sci-fi. It's not interested in gadgets or interstellar missions. Instead, it quietly unravels into something far darker, a meditation on identity, grief, and the limits of empathy, wrapped in a 1960s aesthetic that's all too familiar and all the more chilling because of it. The reviews were mixed. A 7.2 on IMDb, an 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. It didn't shock like White Bear or dazzle like USS Callister. But to those who connected with it, it didn't need to. They saw something else, something colder, quieter, more devastating. Because Beyond the Sea isn't really about space or even about technology. It's about what's left of us when everything else is stripped away. Imagine this. Someone borrows your face, your voice, your gestures. They step into your life, wear your skin, sleep in your bed, not out of malice, but because you offered it. Out of kindness. Out of guilt. And when they betray that kindness, who's really at fault? That's the knife this episode twists slowly. What if grief doesn't just hollow you out, but warps you until you want others to feel what you feel? What if connection itself, once sacred, once human, is so fragile that even the slightest fracture becomes a death sentence? And most unsettling of all, what if the technology meant to bring us closer only exposes how truly alone we are? That's where we begin. Not with a story about astronauts, but with a question about ourselves. Why set a story about identity collapse in 1969? And why bury a psychological horror inside a spaceship draped in vintage decor? To understand Beyond the Sea, you have to start with Charlie Brooker's obsession with contradictions, the modern and the retro, the intimate and the uncanny, the human and the artificial. This episode, directed by John Crowley and written by Brooker himself, is one of Black Mirror's boldest formal experiments, a high-concept emotional tragedy disguised as a Cold War-era sci-fi drama. On the surface, it feels like an episode lost in time. Aesthetically, it leans into everything we associate with the space age, burnished wood panels, analog consoles, the golden optimism of 1960s America. But this optimism is a lie. Beneath the vintage glow is a story about technological trauma, male ego, and the fragility of connection. The retro setting isn't just set dressing, it's a weapon. Brooker chose 1969 not for nostalgia, but for irony. This was the year humanity walked on the moon, when technology promised transcendence. But in the world of Beyond the Sea, that promise curdles into existential dread. The very devices that bridge light years become instruments of isolation. It's 2001, a space odyssey flipped inside out, Kubrickian in visual restraint, but narratively intimate and emotional to the core. And the casting? That was no accident. Aaron Paul, forever burned into pop culture as Jesse Pinkman, is weaponized here in the opposite direction. No street slang, no explosive outbursts. His character, Cliff, is all containment. He's the man who never says what he feels until it's far too late. His silence does the talking. Meanwhile, Josh Hartnett's David, charismatic and soft-spoken, represents the more sensitive masculinity, but it's this sensitivity that eventually unravels into obsession and cruelty. Interestingly, Hartnett almost didn't take the role. Scheduling issues nearly derailed the shoot, and Brooker reportedly considered rewriting the part entirely to fit another actor. But when Hartnett came on board, the script was preserved, and with it, the delicate tension between David's vulnerability and his moral collapse. Behind the camera, John Crowley, known for Brooklyn, brought a surprisingly theatrical sensibility to the production. His direction is intimate, quiet, often unnervingly still. He allows silences to stretch, rooms to breathe, faces to do the work of dialogue. It's not TV pacing, it's stage pacing. And it forces the audience to sit with the discomfort. Production-wise, the episode was shot on location in the UK and Spain. But instead of leaning into digital gloss, the crew opted for a tactile, almost analog style. The spacecraft interior was built as a fully enclosed set, allowing for 360-degree camera movement and a claustrophobic atmosphere. Meanwhile, the Earth-side scenes were filmed in rural Spain, drenched in warm sunlight, a jarring contrast to the metallic chill of orbit. That contrast wasn't just aesthetic. It was ideological. What Brooker and Crowley wanted to explore was this. What happens when a man builds a machine to escape his loneliness, only to find that loneliness waiting for him on the other side? And maybe that's the real tragedy of this episode. It's not the deaths. It's not the betrayal. It's that the future arrived, and it still couldn't fix the human condition. In Beyond the Sea, the camera doesn't just observe. It accuses. John Crowley's direction strips motion from the frame. In space, we rarely get handheld shots or kinetic angles. Instead, the camera lingers. Wide shots dominate. Long takes force us to sit in rooms too quiet, with men too contained. And that's the point. This is not a story told through action but through restraint. In one of the most telling scenes, David, inside Cliff's replica, dances with Lana in their living room. It's an ordinary moment, except isn't. The lighting is warm, the camera glides gently. But there's a slow pan to Cliff's portrait on the wall, his eyes frozen mid-smile watching. The frame traps all three of them in a visual triangle. It's beautiful, but it's wrong. And the camera knows it. There's no dramatic music to warn us. Just the friction of breath, the creak of floorboards, and the sense that something deeply unethical is happening in a scene that looks, at first glance, tender. The cinematography is doing something rare here. It creates moral discomfort without moralizing. It doesn't need to tell us what's right or wrong. It just shows us the line, and how easily it can be crossed when everyone is too lonely to notice. At first glance, Cliff and David seem like archetypes, the stoic and the sensitive. But the episode systematically inverts those expectations. Cliff Aaronpaul is the one we assume will break first. He's emotionally closed off, distant from his wife, often cold. But it's David Josh Hartnett, the poet and painter, who deteriorates into violence. The sensitive man becomes the monster. The tragedy isn't that David loses his family. It's that he loses his ability to mourn them without making someone else suffer too. This inversion complicates the viewer's sympathies. We don't just watch a betrayal, we watch the emotional logic that builds toward it, brick by brick. Lana, Kate Mara, plays a deceptively quiet role in this dynamic. At first, she feels like the standard sci-fi wife, beautiful, patient, isolated. But there's a crucial layer of nuance. She's not just lonely, she's spiritually abandoned. Cliff's emotional unavailability opens a space, and David's intrusion fills it. But what begins as shared vulnerability becomes emotional colonization. Her arc isn't one of moral failure. It's about being seen, then being used. David sketches Lana, first innocently, then nude. It's not just creepy. It's a violation of boundaries dressed up as art. But here's the subtext. David paints not what is, but what he wants. The image becomes a claim, a declaration, a replacement. The portrait is a reverse mirror of his loss. He lost his wife and daughters. Now he wants to steal someone else's family, but under the guise of empathy and beauty. It's a devastating metaphor for how art, when untethered from ethics, can become possession, not creation. Also notable is the design of the spacecraft. All polished metal, smooth panels, and fluorescent silence. It reflects nothing human. Cliff's only refuge is his woodshop, a room where he builds by hand, trying to carve control out of chaos. In contrast, David's Earth home was filled with oil paints, warm lights, laughter. He didn't just lose a family. He lost his entire emotional language. And so he tries to paint his way into someone else's life. This contrast in design, a cold mechanical orbit versus a warm, tactile Earth, isn't just aesthetic. It's psychological cartography. It maps exactly what each man is losing and why their collision becomes inevitable. Beyond the Sea doesn't follow the typical Black Mirror structure of a high-concept twist or last-minute reveal. Instead, it's designed like a slow-turning screw. Every scene just tightens the pressure by 1 degree until something snaps. The story moves in 4 deliberate acts. Harmony and duality. We're introduced to the 2 astronauts living double lives, one on Earth through their replicas, and one in space aboard a sterile ship. Shatterpoint. David's family is murdered by the cult. The natural order is disrupted, emotionally, ethically, technologically. Reconfiguration and trespass. David begins to borrow Cliff's body, then slowly hijacks his life. The boundaries between grief and desire, empathy and envy begin to collapse. Revenge and ruin. The narrative doesn't climax in confrontation, but in irreversible violation. The final act of violence isn't a twist, it's an inevitability. And here's what's genius about the structure. The audience always knows more than the characters. We see David's obsession long before Cliff does. We see Lana's growing discomfort before she can name it. And we know, deep down, that this can only end one way. That omniscient dread is the episode's true horror engine. This is tragedy in the Greek sense, not what happens, but can anyone stop it? John Crowley, known for his emotionally precise work in Brooklyn, is an unconventional choice for Black Mirror. But that's what makes this episode work. Where previous episodes like White Bear or Smithereens use chaos and speed to escalate tension, Beyond the Sea does the opposite. It uses quiet. Crowley's camera doesn't chase drama. It waits for it. He loves symmetry, negative space, and uncomfortably long pauses. One recurring motif is the doorway, characters often framed while entering or leaving rooms. It's a subtle visual echo of the threshold between identities, between selves. Compare this to USS Callister, S4, E1. Both episodes explore men living through digital proxies. But Callister builds to a sci-fi escape. Beyond the Sea refuses that relief. It leaves us staring into the thing Callister flinched from. What if the villain doesn't want power, but intimacy? The musical choice of Charles Trennett's La Mer is another subtle masterstroke. It's romantic, nostalgic, full of longing. But when David dances to it with Lana in Cliff's body, it becomes grotesque. The song stays the same. We don't. That's pure Black Mirror. Here's where the episode fractures audiences most: David's descent. Some critics praise it as a profound portrait of grief metastasizing into cruelty. They argue that David is less a villain and more a cautionary tale. What happens when empathy turns parasitic? Others call it abrupt, even cartoonish. How does a loving father become a cold-blooded killer in 40 minutes? The episode gives no clear answer. And that ambiguity is the point. David doesn't break. He erodes. And Cliff, he's no hero either. Critics have pointed out that his silence, his passivity, his emotional unavailability, these are not neutral traits. They are part of the chain of failures that lead to the disaster. Even Lana's role is debated. Some call her underwritten. Others argue she's the most realistic character, a woman navigating the emotional fallout of two men trying to claim her life as therapy. So where does that leave us? Exactly where Black Mirror wants us. Not sure who to blame, only sure that something has gone irreparably wrong. It's easy to see Beyond the Sea as a psychological story, but that would be missing the point. This isn't just about one man's grief or another man's silence. This is about a system that pretends to offer connection, while actively eroding the foundation of human identity. In this alternate 1969, society has solved the problem of distance, but not the problem of empathy. The replica system is sold as a miracle. Astronauts can see their families, live their lives, be home while millions of miles away. But what's the cost? What does it mean to be present when your presence is just a projection? What happens to the soul when the body becomes interchangeable? David's tragedy is not just personal. It's engineered. The technology that was meant to keep him sane has made his grief unbearable. His replica wasn't a comfort, it was a dependency. And when it was destroyed, so was his only sense of self. Cliff, too, is a victim of the same system, just one who breaks slower. His faith, his masculinity, his duty, all are rooted in control. But when his wife begins to respond to a version of him that isn't him, his identity begins to unravel. The system promised intimacy. What it delivered was simulacra. The deeper message: these men aren't just lost. They're manufactured casualties of a world that builds tools faster than it builds meaning. Let's break it down to the bones. David wants what Cliff has. Cliff won't give it. But the tragedy isn't rooted in jealousy alone. It's about how each man deals with vulnerability. Cliff shuts down. He paints alone. He prays. He avoids intimacy even when it's in reach. David opens up, but only to consume. His grief makes him feel entitled to someone else's peace. This is not a story of a villain and a victim. It's a story of two emotional failures, spiraling toward mutual destruction. Their conflict is Shakespearean in structure, but distinctly modern in tone. Neither man knows how to ask for help, and both are trapped in performative roles, Cliff as the strong silent type, David as the tragic romantic. What's terrifying is how those roles collapse in reverse. Cliff ends up broken and hysterical. David becomes cold and methodical. And Lana? She's caught in their storm, not because she chooses to be, but because she's never truly granted agency in the system that surrounds her. Her role reveals one of the episode's most important and least discussed layers. This isn't just about men and machines. It's about how patriarchal expectations treat women as emotional terrain to be claimed or preserved. Lana is expected to comfort, to endure, to forgive. But in truth, she's just as trapped as they are, another casualty of the technological miracle that promised domestic perfection without emotional labor. Strip away the sci-fi trappings, and what are you left with? Two men, alone in the heavens, bound by duty and bloodless sacrifice. One loses everything, the other offers a hand. But instead of healing, the offer becomes the trigger. Sound familiar? The story mirrors the biblical myth of Cain and Abel, but with a Black Mirror twist. Cain's jealousy leads to fratricide, but here, it's not God who is silent. It's the system. There's no divine punishment, no moral resolution. Just two men, afloat in space, sentenced to live with what they've done. Even the episode's title, Beyond the Sea, acts as a bitter metaphor. It evokes romance and longing, but in context, it becomes a cruel irony. There is no sea, no return, only vacuum. The real sea is intimacy itself, vast, unreachable, and ultimately unforgiving. In the end, the episode isn't warning us about technology. It's warning us that without emotional accountability, even the most advanced systems will become weapons in the hands of the broken. Some called it brilliant. Others called it inert. After Beyond the Sea aired, Reddit threads lit up. Think pieces multiplied. And yet, the reactions were eerily binary, either stunned praise or utter frustration. Why? Because this is not a story that offers closure. It offers exposure. It exposes the wounds we'd rather keep covered. Grief that festers, kindness that backfires, and the unbearable weight of being needed when you have nothing left to give. The silence at the end of the episode, two men adrift, one guilty, one destroyed, is what polarized viewers. Some interpreted it as profound. Others called it unfinished. But that silence is precisely what makes it Black Mirror. It doesn't teach. It confronts. Is David responsible for what he did? Absolutely. He made the choice to violate another's life. Not out of necessity, but out of ego and unresolved trauma. Is Cliff to blame? Partially. His emotional inaccessibility, though not malicious, created a vacuum. He also underestimated the fragility of the system he was participating in, both technological and emotional. What about the system that allowed this transfer of identity? Here lies the heart of the ethical dilemma. The replica technology erases clear lines of accountability. When someone commits a crime in someone else's body, who stands trial? The mind or the flesh? The one who pulled the trigger, or the body whose finger moved? The episode offers no clear answer, but that's the point. It mirrors our real-world struggles with digital identity, AI impersonation, and deepfake ethics. In an age where behavior can be digitally simulated or controlled by others, the boundaries of personal responsibility are becoming harder to define. This is not just a tragedy. It's a legal, philosophical, and technological time bomb. One of the most disturbing aspects of this episode is how every moral principle is inverted by the end. Empathy becomes intrusion. Permission becomes violation. Grief becomes justification for atrocity. When Cliff allows David to use his replica, it's framed as compassion. But in a system that can't regulate intent or identity, compassion becomes risk. A loophole. And this is where the episode delivers its most subversive message. Being good isn't always enough, especially when systems are built without safeguards. Cliff believed in decency. David believed in connection. Both were betrayed by a world that mistook technological ability for ethical readiness. This ethical inversion plays out most clearly in the final act. David kills not because he wants power, but because he wants equal pain. Cliff survives not as a moral victor, but as a man stripped of everything decency was supposed to protect. The family, the marriage, the child, they are collateral damage in a moral system that failed to anticipate what grief does to logic. When do we cross the line? The genius of Beyond the Sea is that it never shows the murders directly. It only shows the aftermath, the blood, the silence, the stunned expressions. It puts the weight not on what happened, but on what was allowed to happen. That's what sticks with the audience long after the credits roll. Because the true horror here is not the violence. It's the fact that none of it had to happen. The line wasn't crossed in a single moment. It was slowly eroded over hours, through gestures that seemed kind, words that seemed harmless, and silences that seemed safe. Until suddenly it wasn't. And in that way, Beyond the Sea isn't just about astronauts or replicas. It's about us. How many times have we seen good intentions left unguarded? How often have systems been designed for convenience, but not for protection? And how often have we told ourselves it'll be fine, right before everything collapses? The concept of replica bodies with transferable consciousness may sound futuristic, but its philosophical essence, digital proxies replacing real presence, is already embedded in our daily lives. Think about it. Remote work has turned living rooms into control rooms. AI avatars now respond to your customer service complaints. Virtual influencers build emotional bonds with millions, despite never having a heartbeat. Chatbots trained on loved ones' data can now mimic dead relatives' voices. We no longer need sci-fi hardware to live through replicas. We've already outsourced parts of our identity to screens, to code, to behavior train models. And much like in Beyond the Sea, we tell ourselves this is connection. But deep down, we know it's compromise. Technology has solved distance, but it hasn't solved presence. One of the most unnerving aspects of this episode is its quiet challenge to how we think about intimacy. David didn't just inhabit Cliff's body, he inhabited Cliff's family life. He used empathy as a Trojan horse to cross a line that, in a digital future, might not even exist anymore. This reflects a growing real-world concern. If an AI model trains on your partner's voice, tone, and behaviors, is it cheating to love it? If a digital replica of someone continues to text, call, or visit after they've died, what happens to grief? We are already testing these boundaries. Apps like Replica and Hereafter use machine learning to create emotional companions. Some are modeled after the living, others after the deceased. And in almost every case, the user claims, it's comforting. It feels like them. Just like David said about Cliff's replica, it's like being alive again. But it's not. And Beyond the Sea forces us to reckon with that lie. Another subtle but sharp critique in this episode lies in its portrayal of mental disintegration under artificial balance. The astronauts are supposed to have the best of both worlds, Earth and orbit, family and mission, presence and purpose. But instead, they become fractured men, unable to truly exist in either place. This directly mirrors the real psychological toll of hyperconnectivity. Zoom fatigue from performing presence across time zones. Work from home identity bleed, where your job seeps into your bedroom. Social media parasocial exhaustion, where we're emotionally engaged with people we don't know in real life. In each of these modern phenomena, our consciousness is stretched, constantly toggling between contexts. And the mind, like David's, eventually begins to glitch. When presence becomes perpetual, identity becomes performative. Are we building systems that break us? Let's be brutally honest. The replica system in Beyond the Sea is not broken. It works exactly as intended. That's what makes it horrifying. Because the real question is not what went wrong. It's, what kind of world designs connection without resilience? Who builds systems that assume grief is rational or that loneliness can be paused? What happens when we forget that emotions don't follow the architecture of our inventions? And if these questions feel uncomfortable, it's because they should. We are, right now, building such systems around AI, VR, digital twins, and beyond without fully confronting the psychological and ethical terrain they occupy. We think we're advancing, but Beyond the Sea reminds us, progress without boundaries isn't evolution. It's erosion, human resilience in a glitching world. Is there a way out? And yet, the episode doesn't leave us without hope. Cliff, however late, tries to draw a line. He says no. He confronts. He mourns. He refuses to become the thing that hurt him. Even Lana, cornered emotionally, never surrenders her agency. Her silences are not submission, they are resistance. What the episode whispers beneath the horror is that human resilience lies not in avoiding pain, but in refusing to project it onto others. In a world of infinite simulations and emotional shortcuts, true presence becomes the rarest, most radical act. Online reactions to Beyond the Sea didn't explode in viral meme formats like some Black Mirror episodes. Instead, they lingered, quietly crawling into comment threads and fan edits with the intensity of something unresolved. On Twitter, one of the most shared phrases paraphrased David's arc in chilling simplicity. He didn't want a new life. He wanted someone else's. It wasn't framed as a twist. It was framed as a pattern. Reddit users drew comparisons to mythological betrayal stories, labeling Cliff and David saints of grief, one who burns, one who breaks. Some TikTok creators took it further, staging role-play scenes in replica POV format, emotional confessions delivered through borrowed bodies, where the face is familiar, but the speaker is not. This wasn't just fandom. It was collective discomfort translated into content. The episode hadn't shocked people, it had gotten under their skin. And that's what made it stick. Films that echo its emotional DNA. If you're looking for stories that tap into the same moral unease and psychological fragmentation, these 4 films won't just complement Beyond the Sea, they'll deepen its resonance. Coherence, 2013. A quiet dinner spirals into existential chaos when parallel universes overlap. Why it matters. It captures how the smallest cracks in reality can rupture trust, and how people fracture when confronted with versions of themselves they don't recognize. Possessor, 2020. Directed by Brandon Cronenberg, this film follows a corporate assassin who hijacks other people's bodies to carry out killings. Why it matters. Like Beyond the Sea, it questions what's left of you when your body becomes a weapon for someone else's story. Perfect Sense, 2011. As a strange pandemic causes humanity to gradually lose all sensory perception, 2 lovers cling to what little of the world, and each other, they have left. Why it matters. It explores what love means when language, memory, and feeling begin to collapse, eerily parallel to Lana's emotional displacement. Time Crimes, 2007. A man stumbles into a time loop and becomes the very danger he was trying to avoid. Why it matters. This film, like Beyond the Sea, explores how good intentions mutate when we try to control outcomes we're not meant to touch. Books that widen the frame. The Body in Pain, Elaine Scarry. A philosophical examination of how physical pain destroys language and dismantles identity. Why it matters. It helps contextualize David's emotional collapse, not as irrational violence, but as the loss of narrative coherence under extreme grief. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, Robert A. Heinlein. A novel about revolution, consciousness, and rebellion against systemic control. Why it matters. This is the very book David gives to Lana, a gesture framed as intimate, but quietly manipulative. In context, it's not a gift. It's a warning. The Shallows, Nicholas Carr. A study of how the internet is rewiring the brain, pushing us toward fragmented attention and shallow thought. Why it matters. It brings urgency to the episode's warning. Technology may expand access, but it erodes depth. The more we simulate presence, the less we actually feel it. Never Let Me Go, Kazuo Ishiguro. In a world where cloned children are raised solely to donate their organs, questions of love, dignity, and meaning become hauntingly urgent. Why it matters. It's a quiet tragedy about beings created for others' convenience, echoing how the replica system in Beyond the Sea reduces bodies to emotional utilities. What all these works share is a rejection of easy answers. Like Beyond the Sea, they aren't trying to entertain, they're trying to hold a mirror up to systems that look seamless from the outside, but are built on silent exploitation. These aren't just post-episode recommendations. They're coordinates in a larger map of stories that ask, what happens when identity becomes portable? When presence becomes performative? And when the face looking back at you might not be yours anymore? What do we see when we're no longer seen? There's a moment near the end of Beyond the Sea that refuses to leave. No dialogue, no music, just 2 men sitting across from each other in the capsule. One has lost everything. The other destroyed it. There is nothing left to say. They are alive. They are conscious. They are irreparably alone. This is not a moment of climax. It's a terminal pause, the kind of silence that only comes after the final line has been crossed. Not just between characters, but between humans and the systems they believed would save them. At the heart of this story isn't technology. It's proximity without presence, empathy without ethics, and identity without consent. It's about what happens when human emotions are forced to operate inside mechanical systems that were never designed to carry them. We often think about dystopia as something that happens in the future, something with chrome panels and authoritarian interfaces. But Beyond the Sea doesn't show us the future. It shows us the emotional wasteland of the present. A world where love is digitized, grief is unsupervised, loneliness is scheduled, and boundaries are virtual, which means they are always on the edge of being violated. The result? The most humane parts of us become fragile, tradable, and ultimately expendable. Which brings us to Never Let Me Go, Ishiguro's quiet masterpiece that echoes Beyond the Sea in form, feeling, and fatalism. In Never Let Me Go, we meet children raised in an idyllic English boarding school. They're educated, sheltered, encouraged to express themselves through art and emotion. It all feels eerily gentle until we realize the truth. These children are clones. They were created to be organ donors. Their entire existence is utilitarian. Their bodies are not their own. Their futures were never theirs to begin with. And yet they dream. They love. They make art. They beg for deferrals. They hope. This is not a story of rebellion. It's a story of slow, dignified submission to a system that sees them only as parts. What does this have to do with Beyond the Sea? Everything. In both works, human beings are treated as vessels, bodies for others to use, preserve, or discard. Intimacy is regulated, not by laws, but by structures so normalized they're invisible. Death is accepted, not because it's natural, but because the alternative, resistance, feels unreachable. David, like a donor clone, is given temporary access to a life that isn't his. At first, it's framed as healing. Then it becomes appropriation. Then violence. He wasn't granted Cliff's body. He was allowed to haunt it. And like all ghosts, he eventually begins to believe he belongs in the house. Cliff, for his part, is not innocent. His emotional closure is its own kind of violence. He lives beside his wife, not with her. And when David enters that space, physically, emotionally, he is simply moving into a vacancy that was already there. In Never Let Me Go, the most heartbreaking moment is when Kathy, the protagonist, watches the man she loves complete the euphemism for death and doesn't scream. She simply drives away, the fields blurring past her, letting the silence fill the car. Sound familiar? In Beyond the Sea, Cliff returns to space, sees the empty replica of his wife, and doesn't cry. Doesn't scream. He just sits. Like Kathy. Like all of us, when systems fail, but offer no one to blame. What makes these stories so devastating? They don't show people being crushed by violence. They show people learning to live with their own disposability. The horror isn't in the murder. It's in the realization that even if it hadn't happened, nothing would have saved them. No system is watching. No law protects emotional autonomy. No boundary holds when grief decides it shouldn't. And no amount of technology can replicate being truly known. This is why David paints. This is why Kathy collects cassette tapes. This is why Cliff builds wood carvings. They're not hobbies. They're acts of preservation, little attempts to remind themselves that they are more than what the world has decided to use them for. It's also why these stories resist catharsis. They don't let us feel righteous. There's no villain to defeat. No monster in the shadows. Just systems. And people slowly adjusting to cruelty because it's wrapped in routine. And so we're left with the hardest questions. What does it mean to be emotionally replaceable? Is grief an excuse to cross moral lines, or the first thing that should keep us from doing so? Can empathy survive in a world built to erase personal boundaries? And perhaps most terrifying, in the future we're building, where your voice, your face, your patterns can be copied, how will you know it's really you that people love? These are not science fiction questions anymore. They are emotional questions disguised as technical ones. And if Beyond the Sea and Never Let Me Go offer us any wisdom, it's this. A life is not something you borrow. A body is not a rental. And intimacy, real intimacy, can't survive unless we protect the edges of who we are. So here's where I leave you, not with an answer, but with an image. Two men, suspended in space. No sound, no path forward, no rewind button. One killed, the other watched. Neither will ever be seen the same way again. If you were in that room, if you had to look across at the person who stole your world, what would you say? And more importantly, what would you still believe in when everything else has gone? Let me know in the comments. Use a single emoji to describe how Beyond the Sea made you feel. And if this film reminded you of a story the world should be paying more attention to, share it. Let's build a new kind of canon. One where silence doesn't mean surrender, and presence doesn't require a replica.